for me to talk about the introduction. I'm Mohammad Ghaedi, a visiting scholar at George Mason University and a member of the board of directors at the Political Psychology Committee of the Iranian Political Science Association. On behalf of the Iranian Political Science Association and also the House for Social Science Scholars in Iran, I want to welcome you out to our event today. Professor Márta Cottam and our audience in Iran and abroad, welcome. This is part of our lecture series on political psychology. In addition to the intellectual and academic aspects, I'm delighted that these events help get the academic communities in the US and Iran closer, despite differences and disagreements in political arenas among leaders. Today, Professor Cottam will talk about the analytical utility of combining image and social identity theories in the study of political behavior. As more people are joining us, I want to mention that most of our colleagues in Iran do not use Zoom. Some of them are installing it for our events. In addition, recently Zoom has restricted its services in Iran due to sanctions. We might move to other platforms in the future talks, but this talk will be recorded and will be available on my YouTube channel and other social media accounts. You can follow us and get the latest updates about the future events on platforms such as Eventbrite and Telegram. The links are available in chat. I'm going to switch to Farsi to introduce our today's speaker, but first I have a question from the audience. Please go to chat and type for us where you are watching us from. Now let's switch to Farsi. سلام به همگی مخاطبان عزیز. از طرف کمیته روانشناسی سیاسی انجمن علوم سیاسی ایران و خانه اندیشمندان علوم انسانی به سخنران عزیز خانم دکتر کاتم و مخاطبین محترم خوش آمد میگویم. پیش از هر چیز از حاضران عزیز خواهش میکنم که به بخش چت برید و برای ما بنویسید که از چه منطقه‌ای برنامه ما رو تماشا میکنید. این با ما کمک میکنه اطلاعات بهتری در مورد مخاطبان به دست بیاریم که در طراحی برنامه‌های بعدی مفید خواهد بود. این سومین سخنرانی از مجموعه سخنرانی‌های کمیته روانشناسی سیاسی انجمن علوم سیاسی ایرانم. در سخنرانی اول با عنوان روانشناسی سیاسی نیازها و ضرورت‌های ایران 1400 بنده و آقای دکتر علی اشرف نظری در مورد کاربرد روانشناسی سیاسی در ایران صحبت کردیم. در اون سخنرانی ما تلاش کردیم بحث‌های مقدماتی در حوزه‌های معرفت شناسی، روش شناسی، اهمیت و کاربردهای عملی روانشناسی سیاسی رو طرح کنیم و با نشون دادن تصویر بزرگتر فضا رو برای سخنرانی‌های بعدی آماده کنیم. در سخنرانی دوم آقای دکتر رادپارت در مورد قدرت، خشونت، احساسات و رشد گروه‌های افراطی صحبت کردند. در سخنرانی امروز خانم دکتر کاتم در مورد دو نظریه مرتبط با روانشناسی اجتماعی و شناختی در تحلیل رفتار سیاسی صحبت خواهند کرد. در سخنرانی‌های آینده در مورد تاریخ و روانشناسی سیاسی، روایت و روانشناسی سیاسی و روانشناسی رهبران سخنرانانی دعوت خواهیم کرد. امیدوارم که در جلسات آینده از حضور اساتید ایرانی که در حوزه روانشناسی سیاسی پژوهش و تالیف کردن برای ارائه آثارشون بهره مند بشیم. همچنین پیشنهاد میکنم در یکی از جلسات آینده برای همفکری با شما برای گرفتن بازخورد و بهبود کیفیت و بهره برداری بیشتر از سخنرانی‌ها یک جلسه مستقل داشته باشیم. روانشناسی سیاسی پتانسیل زیادی برای شکوفایی و رشد در ایران داره و امیدوارم که علاقه‌مندان به اون در اینجا جمع بشن و هسته مرکزی شکل‌گیری فعالیت‌های جدی به ویژه در حوزه نظری و تحقیقی رو ایجاد کنند. لطفاً برای دریافت ایمیل برنامه‌های بعدی ما به وبسایت ایونتبرایت برید، حساب کاربری کمیته روانشناسی سیاسی رو دنبال کنید. لینک‌های اون رو من در بخش چت قرار دادم. همچنین به تازگی کانال روانشناسی سیاسی رو در تلگرام ایجاد کردیم که در اونجا اطلاعات برنامه‌ها و همچنین پاورپوینت سخنرانی‌ها رو قرار خواهیم داد. لینک کانال تلگرام هم توی بخش چت قرار داده شده. اما اجازه بدید که سخنران امروز رو معرفی کنم. خانم دکتر مارتا کاتم استاد ممتاز بازنشسته مدرسه علوم سیاسی، فلسفه و سیاستگذاری عمومی دانشگاه ایالتی واشنگتن. ایشون در سال 1983 دکترای خودش را از دانشگاه کالیفرنیا در لس آنجلس گرفت. حوزه تخصصی ایشون روانشناسی سیاسی، روابط بین الملل و سیاست خارجی آمریکاست. حاصل پژوهش‌های ایشون در قالب کتاب‌های ذیل عرضه شده: تصاویر و مداخلات، سیاست ایالات متحده در آمریکای لاتین در سال 1994، ناسیونالیسم و سیاست، رفتار سیاسی ملت دولت‌ها در سال 2001، مقدمه‌ای بر روانشناسی سیاسی، ویرایش چهارم در سال 2022، مقابله با القاعده، بیداری سنی و راهبرد آمریکا در الانبار در 2016 و نقش مبارزان زن در انقلاب و جنگ ضد انقلابی نیکاراگوآ در سال 2019. علاوه بر کتاب‌های خانم کاتم، من در سال 2018 مصاحبه مفصلی با ایشون انجام دادم و در صورتی که علاقه‌مند باشید میتونید این مصاحبه رو در وبسایت من ببینید. لینک مصاحبه رو در بخش چت قرار دادم. اگر سوالی دارید لطفاً در بخش چت بنویسید. در پایان سخنرانی از خانم کاتم پرسیده بشه. من به زبان انگلیسی برای معرفی سخنران برمیگردم و از ایشون دعوت میکنم سخنرانیشون رو ایراد کنن. I'm switching back to English. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our today's guest. Dr. Marta Cottam is Professor Emeritus of Political Science in the School of Politics, Philosophy and Public Affairs at Washington State University. She received her PhD from UCLA in 1983. Her areas of specialization include political psychology, American foreign policy, and international politics. She has authored or co-authored Images and Interventions, U.S. Policies in Latin America in 1994. Nationalism and Politics, The Psychological Behavior of Nation States in 2001. Introduction to Political Psychology, the 4th edition is coming in 2022. Confronting Al-Qaeda, The Sunni Awakening and American Strategy in Al-Anbar in 2016, and the role of female combatant in the Nicaraguan Revolution and counter-revolutionary war in 2019. After Dr. Cottam's presentation, we'll have some time for questions. If you have any questions, I encourage you to ask them in chat. Dr. Cottam, I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I will be back with questions from our audience in a few minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. It's really quite a privilege to speak to scholars from the Iranian Political Science Association. Mohammad is going to do the PowerPoint, which he's translated into Farsi. So I will periodically ask him to shift pages in the PowerPoint. So what I'm going to do today is talk about two theories in political psychology, which have become in combination really useful in enabling us to understand a wide variety of political behaviors. And these theories are image theory and social identity theory. I'm going to do an overview of the theories, and then Mohammad, if you change to the next slide, this is basically where I'm going to go. I'll do an overview of the theories. I'm sorry if I bore those of you who are familiar with the theories, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then I'm going to do some very quick applications of the combination of the theories to nationalism and to ethnic and sectarian conflicts. I'll use a couple of examples. So let me begin with image theory. These theories give us very good insight into how people perceive themselves in terms of social identity and how people perceive others in terms of image theory. As I describe the theories, they seem very technical, but once one starts to apply the theories, they become very rich in enabling us to understand the the shifts in political behavior as images of others and social identity factors interact with each other. And in some cases produce a tremendous amount of sacrifice and tremendous amounts of violence. So I will begin with a brief overview of image theory. So that's the next slide. There we go. It's a basic political psychological framework that draws from common findings in psychology, beginning with way back in the 1950s with balance theory and running all the way through the cognitive revolution. And it draws together some of the basic premises that you can find from those theories in psychology. The first one is, next slide. The first one is that people cannot deal with the complexities of their other way. There we go. People can't deal with the complexities of the world that they live in, that we get simply too much information bombarding us all the time. So we simplify the world in order to make the information more manageable and more easily available to them. They do this simplification of the world by developing cognitive categories, or in political terms, images of people and things. We talk about cognitive categories, it seems very elementary, but once you get into categories of people, it gets more complicated. We have categories of the natural world that help us manage the natural world, birds, dogs, cats. People are different, and they are more complicated, and we see that the categories or images that people use to organize the social world varies depending on what social domain they're moving into. And an important principle here is that the organization of the world, the simplification and organization of the world has to be analytically, has to be cognitively efficient for perceivers. You don't want too much information, you don't want too little information, and the images that are formed help us filter information that we receive. So the next slide, we talk about how information is filtered through the categories. And generally the principle is that people accept information that conforms to the categories and reject information as either false or irrelevant when it does not conform to the categories. So you have plenty of examples from the natural world where you can see that our notions about a bird, for example, is that they have wings and feathers, they fly, they have beaks and so on. And then you have other examples of birds that are unusual and they're more difficult to classify. And sometimes you reject outright the notion that this creature is a bird. For example, ostriches, which don't fly, or penguins, which really don't look like birds. And when you get into the political world, this kind of filtering of information can be extremely strong and can make people extremely unwilling to accept information that challenges their pre-existing beliefs. So generally, the categories form a set of knowledge that is used to understand the world around us. In terms of image theory as applied to politics, we started out way back in the earliest scholars started way back in the 1950s, 1960s, talking about images or perceptions of the enemy in politics. And it initially was a framework that was used simply to understand international politics. But as time has gone on, we found that you can use the same images or categories, sometimes with some adjustments, to apply to domestic politics and transnational politics. So the argument is that the political environment is organized in categories that are images of political actors, such as enemies, allies, imperialists. There are a list, which I'll show you in a minute. And the images function very much like stereotypes. And once you've categorized an actor into one of these images, then they tend to be very difficult to break. Some of them are extremely resistant to contrary information and become self-perpetuating, very difficult to break. Okay, the next slide. There we go. So what we've done, what the literature has done in terms of the construction of image theory is to develop a typology, which is based on the collection of image attributes which are assessed in terms of the perceiver's evaluation of them related to their own group. So you look at another actor or another cluster of actors and you see, how does this group compare to my group in terms of capability? Are they superior to us? Are they equal to us? Or are they inferior? In terms of culture, are they superior, which in the real world in politics means, are they dominating? Are they so powerful in terms of their culture that it's spread worldwide and dominates other people's culture? Are they equal to us, or are they inferior to us? Then decision-making is another attribute of each image that becomes important. And typically what happens is that people will look at another actor and determine whether or not decisions are made by multiple groups. Is there competition for a role in the policymaking arena, or is the decision-making apparatus a monolith? And when you identify a monolith as a decision-making apparatus, that reflects simplification, and largely because you very rarely have political actors in the modern world where you have monolithic decision-making. You typically have either up front and very evident, or behind the scenes, a lot of competition for access to top decision makers, a lot of competition for roles of power and position in that decision-making apparatus. Another attribute that's very important is their intentions. Are their intentions towards us good, harmful, or simply benign? They're not going to help us, they're not going to hurt us. And then finally, there's the question of whether or not the actor is associated with threat or opportunity in the environment. And I can talk later, if you'd like, if you're interested in discussing the where these attributes came from, how people developed them. So the images that are typically used, and this is okay, this one, there's the slide. Yeah, the images that are typically used in image theory analyses are pretty much images that are I would say they're very American oriented in a lot of ways. I think you can go to different parts of the world and find that it is cognitively efficient to have other images that are not listed in this list, but this is the list of images that are found very often in the literature. The PowerPoint slide also points out how they vary in terms of perceptions of capability, culture, intentions, decision-making, and threat or opportunity. So for example, the enemy is, the ideal typical enemy is perceived as equal in capability, equal in culture. Culture may not be one that one likes, but still in terms of their ability to address the literature, the arts, the sciences, technology, make a society run fairly efficiently, it's considered to be equal. Intentions are harmful. Decision-making, the perception is that its decisions are made by a small elite and they're associated with threat. The classic example from the standpoint of the United States, examples plural, would be Hitler in the Second World War and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And today, there is no creature out there, no state out there that fits the real qualifications of an enemy, because there is nobody out there that is equal in capability and culture to capability, culture, harmful, very harmful in intentions to the United States. Let me flip down to the rogue. This is a stereotype, an image that we see so often in American expressions about the activities and intentions of countries like North Korea, Cuba in the past, Iran. Iraq in the past, and that would be a country that is inferior in capability, culture, perceived culture, harmful in intentions, with a small elite, and it's associated with threat. Another one that I'll go through, well, let me go through colonial as well, colonial and the imperial. The colonial is sort of the flip side of the rogue. It's the same kind of capability and culture comparison, but the intentions are very different. It's perceived to be ruled by a small elite, and it's associated not with threat, but that should say opportunity, not threat there. And then the imperial stereotype is of a country that is superior in capability, dominant in culture, harmful in intentions, also ruled by a small elite and associated with threat. So what's really interesting, probably most interesting about the image framework is that you can find that there are particular strategic preferences that are associated with each one of these images. So the next slide. Yes, shows you the strategic preferences. A little off sync, but that's okay. Oh, there we go. So when you look at it, logically, the enemy image is one where you have a perception of high threat, but since it's equal to the perceiver's actor in terms of capability and culture, the ability to carry through on its threats, the chances of defeating it in direct contact would be about 50-50. So what you would prefer to do, circumstances permitting, is to contain it. The one thing you don't want to see is an enemy becoming more powerful than the perceiver's group, and in which case it shifts to a different kind of image. So containment is the best strategy to use with an enemy. But if you go down to the rogue image, this one is where you have a perception of threat that's moderately low because the rogue is relatively weak compared to the perceiver state. So when the opportunity arises, what do? You crush it. I think you can argue fairly effectively that that's exactly what happened in 2003 when the United States decided to invade Iraq. The Bush administration and many Americans outside of the administration saw Iraq as a rogue. The opportunity was evident because we were in Afghanistan anyway, and they went through with their hope that they could crush Saddam Hussein's regime very quickly. And then the colonial image is one in which there's a lot of opportunity to get what you want from the colonial country. You've got a benign relationship with it, and the strategic preference is to control it and, if possible, exploit it, take its resources, have it, try to convince that country or those actors to follow policies that are in your benefit. Now, there are a number of caveats to this framework. The next slide shows caveat number 1. There we go. Not all images are used everywhere. This is a simple and logical outcome of the notion that they need to be cognitively efficient. You're not going to be using an image to understand politics when there is no one out there that's really relevant, that really fits those dynamics. And I think one of the best examples of this is the fact that the image of the imperialist is really meaningless for most Americans. Americans haven't had an imperialist in their environment since 1812. So there's no actor in the world that fits this image for people in the United States. And as a consequence, and that's the next slide, as a consequence of not understanding how you're perceived or not having an image in your worldview that others have and that others apply to you, you have a tremendous amount of misperceptions. Americans do not understand what people are talking about when they describe America as an imperialist. And I'll talk about the US-Mexico relationship in a little bit, but when you get into the kinds of accusations that come with the imperialist image, you're trying to take over, you're trying to control everything, you're trying to exploit us, Americans scratch their heads and they say, what this isn't us, this is not what we do, these are not our intentions. And so you get a significant amount of misunderstanding when people don't share an image through which they are viewed. A second type of caveat, and that's the next slide, is that when we talk about images, as I described them in the typology, that's really the most extreme form of the image. Some actors don't fit very well into an image. And when that happens, it's important to know why they don't fit very well into an image. Is there a doubt about their capability? Is there a doubt about their intention? I mean, there's some aspect of the typology that doesn't fit very well. And when that happens, you tend to get policy disagreements. And that's the next slide, caveat number 3. When you have a disagreement about how well an actor fits into an image, you'll end up with policy disagreements. One of the best examples from history is the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Some people, such as those in the Reagan administration camp, thought that the Soviet Union was close to an ideal typical enemy. Other people from the détente camp, from Nixon to Carter, thought that the Soviet Union was nowhere near as ideal typical by the time you get into the late 1970s and 1980s as it was in earlier days. And so they were much more interested in détente rather than arming as the Reagan administration did. So the next slide actually addresses that point. There you go. When you have disagreements within a government about the image or the goodness of fit, you end up with policy disputes among decision makers. And then the next slide is caveat number 4, which is not all actors actually fit an image. It's possible that there are actors out there who cannot be classified into an image. When that happens, people tend to engage in piecemeal thinking. They have a difficulty in thinking in terms of strategy. And I think today, one of the best examples of that is Russia. Since the end of the Cold War, since the end of the Soviet Union, people across the globe really have been perplexed as to how to classify, how to categorize, how to understand today's Russia. It's not just a small Soviet Union. It's a completely different kind of country. And there's a major struggle to try to figure out exactly what to make of it and how you classify it. And there's, I think, a great concern that the United States might end up reclassifying Russia as an enemy, even though it doesn't fit that particularly well. So the next slide follows up on this one, and that just simply notes that people are going to try to categorize an actor. They're more comfortable, they're more confident when they are able to classify an actor into one or another image. And so there's a constant push to try to classify it and therefore make it more understandable and predictable. Okay. So that is that's going to be all I'm going to say about image theory. It's complicated, and I can go back to answer any questions that you have about it. Social identity theory is the theory that really helps us understand how we see ourselves. And it is a very simple theory from psychology. It has 4 basic principles. People strive to maintain positive self-images. Second, next slide. Membership in groups contribute to one's identity and self-image. People like to belong to groups. Groups help people understand who they are. They provide support, they provide information, and they provide security. So people like to belong to groups. And Next slide. When you belong to a group, you evaluate your group by comparing it to others. It's just a normal process. It seems to be found in minimal groups. Groups of 3 people or more will still engage in group comparison. Artificial groups will engage in group comparison. When psychologists form artificial groups in laboratories, they see the comparison with other groups coming about pretty automatically. And then, next slide, positive social identity. People feel positively about their groups when they have a positive comparison with other groups. People they get an enhanced self-esteem when their own group compares positively with other relevant groups. So next slide, what to do when comparisons are negative. You can abandon the group and join a better one. That's not always possible or desirable. Sometimes people are so attached to their groups, they can't even think about joining another group. And sometimes it's not possible. In the United States, for example, race is a group that you usually can't get out of. You're in it, and you don't have much of an option of moving to another racial group. Second, next slide, is social creativity strategies. And that occurs when you change the comparison dimension. One of my favorite examples is when going back to the early days of immigration into the United States, when you have the Protestant, Northern European wealthy community dominating politics in the big cities in the United States, and then you had an influx of poor immigrants from Ireland. Those poor immigrants from Ireland pretty quickly caught the political power in big American cities like Boston and New York, and they could change the comparison basis. Yeah, we're not wealthy, but we have the political power. That's another possibility. Another social creativity strategy on the next slide is to change the comparison group. And or redefine the basis of comparison from negative to positive. People are looked down at because they're immigrants. Well, they can turn that around and praise their heritage, their ethnicity, and so forth. The final strategy, that's the next slide, is social competition. People can challenge the legitimacy of the status quo. And this doesn't occur often. It takes a tremendous amount of group courage, and it takes the perception within the group that things can change successfully. Somewhere down the road, there is an alternative that's a realistic alternative that the group can pursue. Sometimes this creates a great loss of life on the part of individuals in the group, but the group as a whole will see light at the end of the tunnel, the idea that they can realize a better future. So there are many, many different kinds of politically relevant groups which people can identify with very strongly. I'm going to talk about the nation as one of those groups, and ethnic and sectarian groups as another set of groups that people can identify with very strongly. But there are lots of others. Racial groups are very politically relevant identity groups, tribes, politically relevant identity groups, and so on. There are many, many different kinds of groups that are politically relevant. So next slide. Okay, so what I wanted to do is to give a few examples of the interaction between images and social identity. And the first one I wanted to talk about is nationalism. Very, very powerful group, a group identity for people who are nationalists. They grant their primary political identity to the national community. It produces extreme sensitivity to threats or opportunity to the nation. It creates a concern with the well-being of members. of the nation at home and members of the nation in a diaspora abroad. And it makes people very willing to make sacrifices for the nation. So as a social identity group, nations can be extremely powerful. And I'm going to give an illustration from the United States and the relationship between the United States and Mexico. Nationalism and imagery have had a very powerful impact on bilateral relations between the two countries for decades. And this is especially the case in the war on drugs and immigration more recently. When you look at the ways that we have perceived each other, the images that we have, look at the next slide. The American image of Mexico has been the colonial client traditionally. And the perception has been that Americans are superior, that Mexicans are incompetent, weak, and corrupt, and that we are the ones, Americans are the ones who should determine what policies they follow to help us in the war on drugs and in immigration as well. Now, this image has been extremely powerful in some administrations. It's faded some in others. It came roaring back in the Trump administration. During the 1990s with the Clinton administration, it really weakened a lot. I think it hardly existed in the Obama administration because there was much more recognition of Mexican nationalism and their self-pride, pride in their nation, and much less willingness to boss them around. But it certainly has been a consistent pattern, even though it has had dips in certain administrations. And the Mexican image of Americans, that's the next slide, is the imperialist. They believe that America is powerful and determined to exploit Mexico whenever possible, and that America is always plotting for ways to take over and tell Mexico what to do. The fact that the United States took a third of Mexican territory way back in 1848 is recent news as far as Mexico is concerned. And they are extremely sensitive to being bossed around by the United States and being told what policies they should follow in order to help the United States with its drug problem. So next slide. Mexico is very wary of American power. It is very suspicious that the United States is trying to undermine their sovereignty. Mexicans are very proud of their country and suspicious that if they make concessions to the United States will only make more demands. They believe that the United States has a drug problem. A lot of the drugs that come into the United States come from Mexico, via Mexico if they're coming from South America. And the United States has done nothing but blame them for the problem that Americans have. And Mexico, like the United States, has gone through different episodes in terms of this perception of the United States. With the two presidencies that preceded the current one, they were a little less nationalistic, but the current administration would like very much to get rid of the CIA presence in Mexico, of the Drug Enforcement Administration presence in Mexico, and wants to stop the militaristic approach to controlling drug cartels and try to improve the socioeconomic conditions that Mexicans experience that will therefore make them less interested in joining cartels to traffic drugs. Next slide. Americans, on the other hand, think that Mexicans are responsible for America's problems with drugs. They see the law enforcement as corrupt. They see the criminal cartels as infiltrating Mexican law enforcement, Mexican military, et cetera, and that they are incompetent and unwilling to address drug trafficking. And that this is understandable because Americans also are proud nationalists. It's very difficult for Americans to ask themselves why Americans are consuming so many mind-altering substances. So they blame Mexico. It's the supply of drugs that's the problem, not American national character. And then, of course, the colonial image tells American policymakers, well, you know, the thing to do is to tell Mexico how to fix their problem, which is affecting us. Consequence. Oops. Oh, there we are. I got lost for a minute. The consequences are, Mohammad, do you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I just got switched off suddenly. Okay, so let me wrap this up just by saying that the consequences of this combination of nationalism and imagery is that we have had a great deal of difficulty, I should say inability, to agree on cooperative measures to design strategies to control and eliminate drug trafficking. Instead, we've had counterproductive strategies such as the just a few years ago when America decided to flood Mexico with weapons, which is exactly the worst thing you could do in order to try to address drug trafficking. We have had mutual recrimination threats. Mexico says if the United States is going to threaten us, then we are going to kick out everybody who's involved in the war, every American who's involved in the war on drugs in Mexico. And then the ultimate consequence is thousands of drug-related deaths in the United States and criminal infiltration of Mexico's political and criminal justice system, which threatens Mexican democracy. So the consequences are serious. And I think you can see that they're directly a result of these perceptions. I just wanted to throw in a couple of further examples. The next slide, next three slides, I have two examples of Donald Trump's comments on Mexico, which are, as you can see, very reflective of a offensive colonial image. This is the famous section of his announcement that he was running for president. It's pure Donald Trump. The next slide is a reflection of the assumption that when the United States speaks, Mexico will do what it's told. We'll build a great wall along the southern border. Mexico will pay for the wall 100%. They don't know it yet, but they're going to do it. And then the third slide is then President Peña Nieto, who was the next to last president. The current president is López Obrador. President Nieto called Trump's rhetoric strident and then said, that's how Mussolini got in, that's how Hitler got in. And you think about the fact that these two neighbors are looking at each other in such hostile terms. It's very reflective of mutual imagery and hostility. The final example I wanted to use is ethnic and sectarian identity in Bosnia. Now, Bosnia is an interesting case because it was very, very mixed in terms of intermarriage, living together, and so on. The three most powerful groups in the Bosnia crisis were, of course, the Muslims, the Bosnian Serbs, and the Bosnian Croats. They were, as I said, very mixed. You didn't have strong group identities during the Yugoslavia era. People would not consider themselves a member of either group, but a welcome combination of several of them. And then when Yugoslavia fell apart, and next slide, the umbrella state of Yugoslavia fell apart, that you had a rapid increase in suspicion and hostility among the different groups. They had, each of the groups had radical leaders who emphasized ethnic identity and vilified the other ethnic groups. group boundaries hardened. People who had previously not thought of themselves as belonging to either one or the other group now had to take a position. You had to identify with one group or another. And it's a situation in which neither of the three groups had the power to govern an independent state, which means somebody had to go. And ethnic cleansing became a solution that was followed by particularly the Serbs, but the others as well. And then if you look again at the images, the hatred was fueled by the images, and that's the next slide. The Croatians historically saw the Serbs as barbarians. They saw the Serbs as the largest ethnic group. They saw them as peasants. They dominated the military, so they were very threatening. They were Eastern Orthodox, which the Serbs looked down on. And the Serbs did the Croatians did what you expect them to do when they're dealing with an actor they see as a barbarian. They started to search for allies in Europe. Barbarians more powerful, so you start to search for allies. And as luck would have it, Germany recognized them, and that was about the worst thing that could happen because of the legacy of the Croatian slaughtering of Serbs when they were allied with Adolf Hitler during the Second World War. The Serbs saw the Croats as imperialists, arrogant, Western-oriented and proud of it, Roman Catholics and agents of Hitler during the Second World War. And then both sides saw Muslims as rogues. They were suspicious that they were agents of radical Islam. And they were also traitors who had converted to Islam 600 years ago. Memories are long there as well. So I hope that those two cases give you a brief understanding of the power of these two analytical tools to help us understand political behavior. As I said in the beginning, when you sketch out the theories, they're pretty dry, but once you apply them to the cases, you can see how incredibly powerful they are in producing patterns of behavior that sometimes are very destructive, very violent, and difficult to resolve. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to discuss any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cottam, for your amazing presentation. So the audience, in the case that you have any questions, please ask them in chat. Now I'm going to switch to Farsi for a few minutes. And I should thank Dr. Cottam for her patience because I'm going to speak in Farsi. سلام مجدد به مخاطبین عزیز. خانم کاتم امروز در مورد ترکیب نظریات تصویر و هویت اجتماعی و مزیت ترکیب این نظریات برای ما صحبت کردن. ایشون مثالهایی از کاربرد این چارچوب در تحلیل ناسیونالیسم و مناقشات قومی، مثلا در مورد کیس بوسنی هرزگوین گفتن. من سعی میکنم که توی در خلاصه‌ای که از پرزنتیشن ایشون میگم مثالهای مرتبط با ایران رو جایگزین کنم. ایشون ابتدا با نظریه تصویر یا ایمیج تیوری شروع کردن و گفتن که این نظریه بر اساس یافته‌های ساده روانشناسی که تو دهه 1950 ما در واقع به دست آوردیم و این یافته‌ها یه سری فرض‌های اولیه داره. اینکه افراد ناچارن یک حجم زیادی از اطلاعات در دنیای اطرافشون رو ساده کنن و در دسته‌بندی‌های ساماندهی کنن برای اینکه بتونن دنیا رو بفهمن. این اطلاعات رو وقتی که ما می‌خوایم دنیا رو سازماندهی کنیم از یک فیلترهایی که ذهن ما عبور می‌کنن و این فیلترها در واقع دسته‌بندی‌های ذهنی ما هستن. زمانی که اطلاعات جدیدی ما دریافت می‌کنیم اگر با دسته‌بندی‌های قبلی که ما در ذهنمون داریم مطابقت کنه، ما اطلاعات جدید رو در دسته خودش قرار میدیم و اگر که با اون اطلاعات مطابقت نکنه یا بر اساس دسته‌بندی‌های قبلی ما غلط باشه، ما اطلاعات جدید یا داده‌های جدید رو معمولاً پس میزنیم و قبول نمی‌کنیم. توی روانشناسی به این در واقع استریوتایپ‌ها گفته میشه. توی روانشناسی سیاسی ما به اینها ایمیج‌ها یا تصاویر میگیم. محیط سیاسی هم به شکل دسته‌بندی‌هایی در ذهن ما ساماندهی شده. مثلا وقتی که ما در مورد انواع بازیگران سیاسی فکر می‌کنیم، معمولاً اونها رو به شکل دوست یا دشمن تقسیم بندی می‌کنیم. اما یه مقدار داستان پیچیده‌تر از اینه در ذهن ما و اینکه دسته‌بندی‌های ما معمولاً بیش از دو دسته صرفا دوست و دشمنه. خانم کاتم گفتن که ما معمولا برای اینکه بازیگران سیاسی رو، مثلا فرض کنید یک کشور دیگه، مثلا عربستان سعودی یا روسیه، وقتی در موردش فکر میکنیم، برای اینکه بتونیم اینها رو تو ذهن خودمون دسته‌بندی کنیم و طبقه بندی کنیم، معمولا میایم از یه سری المان‌های عناصری استفاده میکنیم برای ارزش گذاری این بازیگران. مثلا در مورد توانایی‌های این کشورها ما فکر میکنیم، اینکه این کشورها از نظر توانایی نظامی یا اقتصادی برتر از ما هستند، پایینتر از ما هستند، یا اینکه با ما مساوی‌اند. این یکی از اون عناصر هست. دسته‌بندی دوم در مورد فرهنگه. ما فکر میکنیم که بازیگران دیگه آیا از نظر فرهنگی برتر از ما هستند، فروتر و پستر هستند، یا اینکه با ما برابر هستند. یک المان دیگه تعداد تصمیم گیرندگان سیاسی در بازیگران دیگه است. مثلا اون کشور توسط یک تعداد محدودی از افراد فاسد اداره میشه، یا دموکراسی در اون وجود داره و تعداد زیادی از مردم میتونن به شکل چرخشی در حاکمیت تصمیم گیرنده باشن. یک المان دیگه در مورد نیت بازیگران سیاسیه. ما وقتی که میخوایم اونها رو در دسته‌بندی ها خودمون قرار بدیم، فکر میکنیم که اونها آیا نیت‌های شوم و خطرناکی برای ما دارن، آیا نیتشون خیره در مورد ما، یا اینکه نه، در مورد ما نیت خاصی ندارن و بی هدف هستن. و در نهایت بر اساس مجموعه این عوامل توی نظریه تصویر ما فکر میکنیم که کشورهای دیگه یا بازیگران دیگه مثلا گروه‌های سیاسی برای ما تهدید هستن یا فرصت هستن. من میخوام به اسلاید خانم کاتم برم که ایشون اونجا گفتن که ما در نظریه تصویر بر اساس تئوری ایشون 7 تا در واقع بسیار اینجا 7 تا طبقه بندی دسته‌بندی داریم. ما وقتی که در مورد بازیگران دیگه، حالا اجازه بدید بازیگران دیگه رو الان به عنوان کشورها در نظر بگیریم، فکر می‌کنیم که اونها یا دشمن ما هستن، آیا باربریان یا بربر هستن، آیا استعمارگر هستن، مستعمره هستن، دیجنریت که نمیدونم حالا ترجمه فارسی چی بگم، حالا بر اساس المان‌هایی که داریم میشه بهتر شناساییش کرد، روگ یا یاغی هستن، یا اینکه متحد ما هستن. من میخوام یه مثال بزنم از این جدولی که خانم کاتم ارائه دادن. ما مثلا وقتی که در مورد دشمن فکر میکنیم یا انمی، بازیگر سیاسیه که تو ذهن ما در دسته‌بندی‌های ذهنی ما از نظر توانایی‌ها با ما برابره، از نظر فرهنگ با ما برابره، از نظر نیات شومی داره، تعداد تصمیم گیرندگان در اون معمولا یک تعداد محدودی از رهبران هستند و ما در دسته‌بندی نهایتاً تهدید اونها رو قرار میدیم. یا مثلا در مورد یاغی وقتی که ما فکر میکنیم که یک بازیگر یاغی معمولا از نظر توانایی‌ها از ما پایین‌تره، از نظر فرهنگی از ما پایین‌تره، از نظر مقاصد یا نیت‌های شومی برای ما داره و یک گروه کوچیکی از رهبران اون رو اداره میکنن و در نهایت برای ما تهدید به حساب میاد. خب اینو مثلا من اگه بخوام در مورد مثال آمریکا و شوروی بزنم، شوروی در دوران جنگ سرد برای آمریکا یک انمی یا دشمن به حساب می اومد، چون از نظر توانایی‌ها و فرهنگ آمریکایی‌ها نگاه برابر به شوروی داشتن، در حال یک رقابت بود. از نظر مقاصد شومی داشت و از نظر تعداد تصمیم گیرندگان تعداد کمی از حزب کمونیست در واقع اداره می‌کردن شوروی و در نهایت به عنوان تهدید طبقه بندیش می‌کردن. اما مثلا ممکنه که کشورهای کوچکتری مثلا کوبا برای آمریکا به عنوان انمی به حساب نمی‌اومد، بلکه بیشتر به عنوان یاغی محسوب می‌شد، چون از نظر توانایی‌های نظامی و اقتصادی کوبا از آمریکا پایین‌تر بود، از نظر فرهنگی پایین‌تر طبقه بندی می‌شد، با مقاصد شوم دسته کوچیکی از رهبران ادارهش می‌کردن و در نهایت به عنوان تهدید بهش نگاه کرده می‌شد. حالا اگه بخوام از نگاه رهبران کوبا ما مثلا با آمریکا نگاه کنیم، میتونیم این استدلال رو بیاریم که کوبایی‌ها یا رهبران کوبا آمریکا رو به عنوان بربر نگاه می‌کردن که از نظر کیپیبیلیتی یا توانایی‌ها برتره، از نظر فرهنگ پایین‌تره، چون فرهنگ سرمایه‌داری بود، در حالی که رهبران کوبا معتقد به سوسیالیسم و کمونیسم بودن. مقاصد شومی برای کوبایی‌ها از نظر اونها آمریکایی‌ها داشتن و از نظر کوبایی ها عده کوچیکی یا رهبران کوبا عده کوچیکی از کاپیتالیسم ها آمریکا رو اداره می‌کردن و در نهایت آمریکا به عنوان تهدید به حساب می اومد. بنابراین می‌بینیم که ما وقتی که می‌خوایم کشورها رو ادراکی که ما از کشورها داریم رو بتونیم در دسته‌بندی‌ها قرار بدیم، میتونیم اونها رو به خوبی توی این 7 طبقه بندی قرار بدیم. میتونید الان شما فکر کنید که مثلا عربستان سعودی از نظر رهبران ایران یا از نظر جامعه ایران در کدوم یک از این دسته‌بندی‌ها قرار میگیره، از نظر توانایی‌هاش، فرهنگش، مقاصدش، تعداد تصمیم گیرندگانش و در نهایت اینکه تهدید هست یا فرصت هست. یا مثلا آمریکا از نظر رهبران ایران در کدوم یک از این دسته‌بندی‌ها قرار میگیره. و در نهایت مزیتی که نظریه تصویر داره اینه که به ما میگه که رهبران در نهایت چه جور استراتژی رو انتخاب میکنن در مقابل اون کشور. مثلا استراتژی این که حمله نظامی کنند یا در مقابلش مثلا سد نفوذ ایجاد کنند. در این مورد به ما کمک میکنه. خب ایشون در بخش دوم صحبتشون در مورد نظریه هویت اجتماعی صحبت کردن و گفتن که افراد تلاش میکنن که معمولا تصویر مثبتی یا ادراک مثبتی از خودشون داشته باشن. عضویت در گروه ها کمک میکنه که افراد امنیت بگیرن و یه سری خدماتی رو بگیرن و درک مثبتی از خودشون داشته باشن. و در نهایت اینکه افراد معمولا گروه های خودشون رو با هم دیگه مقایسه میکنن و وقتی که نتیجه این مقایسه مثبته، یعنی گروهشون مثلا میبره در مقایسه با گروه دیگری، افراد تجربه هیجانی و شناختی مثبتی رو دارن، حالشون خوب میشه. حالا این گروه ها میتونن مثلا در نظر بگیرید ملت ها باشن، مثلا ایرانی ها و ملت ترکیه یا مثلا روسیه. وقتی که نتیجه این مقایسه منفیه، یعنی یک فرد به خاطر عضویت در گروهش خودش رو با گروه دیگر مقایسه میکنه و احساس مثبتی نمیکنه، فکر میکنه گروه دیگر بهتره، معمولا افراد 3 استراتژی رو انتخاب میکنن. استراتژی اول اینه که گروه خودشون رو رها میکنن و میرن عضو یک گروه دیگه میشن. مثلا شخص ممکنه که کشورش رو عوض کنه و ما گاهن میبینیم که در بین مهاجرین اصلا دوست ندارن به زبان اصلی خودشون صحبت کنن و دوست ندارن بگن که من اهل اون کشور هستم و سعی دارن که خودشون رو بیشتر بچسبونن و تعریف کنن با هویت ملی جدیدی که مثلا پاسپورت جدید بهشون دادن. بنابراین استراتژی اول. استراتژی دوم اینه که افراد سعی میکنن که در مقایسه خلاق باشن، مثلا معیارهای مقایسه رو تغییر بدن. مثلا اگر که گروهشون از نظر توانایی‌های مالی ضعیفه، به جای اینکه گروه خودشون رو با گروه پولدارتر از نظر مالی مقایسه کنن، میگن عوضش ما ارزش‌های برتری داریم، یعنی معیارهای مقایسه رو تغییر میدن. و استراتژی سوم هم رقابت اجتماعی که اگه به زبان ساده بخوایم بگیم اینه که سعی میکنن وضعیت فعلی رو به چالش بکشن، به عبارت دیگه‌ای وارد دعوا یا جنگ یا مناقشه میشن. این 3 استراتژی. خانم کاتم در مورد ناسیونالیسم و دعواهای مناقشه‌های قومی صحبت کردن و ترکیب این 2 نظریه رو در فهم ناسیونالیسم و مناقشات قومی به کار بردن. توی ناسیونالیسم هویت ملی به عنوان اصل اساسی در تقسیم بندی گروه خودی و غیر خودی به حساب میاد. فردی که ناسیونالیست هست خودش رو به عنوان یک آمریکایی اصیل، روس اصیل یا یک ایرانی آریایی اصیل شناسایی میکنه. بنابراین در مرحله اول داره از نظریه هویت اجتماعی استفاده میکنه برای تعریف خودش و دیگری و این رو در واقع مبنای مقایسه قرار میده و بعد میاد از نظریه تصویر استفاده میکنه برای اینکه بتونه گروه دیگر رو یا دیگری رو در یکی از اون 7 دسته‌بندی که خانم کاتم فرمودن قرار بده. بعد خانم کاتم در سخنرانیشون از مثال فراوانی از آمریکا و مکزیک آوردن. اینکه آمریکایی‌ها به مکزیکی‌ها به چشم مستعمره نگاه میکنن که پلیسش فاسده، مشکلات بسیار مرتبط با مواد مخدر در آمریکا از کارتل‌های مواد مخدر مکزیک میاد و همینطور تصویری که مکزیکی‌ها از آمریکایی‌ها دارن به عنوان کشوری که قدرتمند، استعمارگر، نیت‌های بدی داره و مکزیکی‌ها تجربه این رو هم دارن که آمریکایی‌ها 1/3 مکزیک رو در طول قرن‌های گذشته اشغال کردن و این تجربه تاریخی هم کمک میکنه به شکلگیری این تصاویر خودی و غیر خودی و در قرار گرفتن آمریکا در دسته‌بندی امپریال توی اون 7 دسته‌بندی که خانم کاتم فرمودن. ایشون مثال‌های فراوانی از روابط مکزیک و آمریکا زدن و صحبت‌های از ترامپ و رهبران مکزیک در تایید این دسته‌بندی آوردن. مثال‌های ایشون توی کیس بعدیشون هم در ارتباط با بوسنی هرزگوین بود. من میخوام اجازه بخوام که برگردم به اینکه سوالاتمون رو از خانم کاتم داشته باشیم. من خودم چند تا سوال دارم و تو روزهای گذشته من چند نفرم با من تماس گرفتن چون علاقه‌مند بودن در مورد کتاب مقدمه‌ای بر روانشناسی سیاسی از خانم کاتم که در ایران بسیار شناخته شده است ما ازشون سوال کنیم. من اگر اجازه بدید سوالاتم رو میپرسم و بعد میریم اگر که شما در بخش چت سوالی داشتید وارد اون سوال هم میشیم. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Cottam, for your presentation. I'm switching back to English. So I have first a few questions about image theory. And then in the past days, I've received some questions about your book, Introduction to Political Psychology. At the end of my questions, if you have time, I can ask a few questions about the new editions of your book. So my first question is, what's the relationship between image theory and rat choice or rational choice theory? Does image theory reject all the assumptions of rational choice or no?
It does. It rejects the assumptions of rational choice because it relies on psychology to build the framework. And rational choice is basically an economic theoretical argument about how people make decisions. This image theory is based on cognitive science, which rejects the idea that people are perfect information processors, but instead examines how people go about processing information in a world that's extraordinarily complex. It rejects the idea that people can rationally calculate preferred outcomes given a particular set of information, because they argue that the information is not going to be objectively viewed, but it's going to be filtered through the mechanisms that people use in order to manage their environments.
Right. So do you think that there is not any merit in rational choice, or you think that they can complement each other in some ways?
Well, that's a good question. I think that they can complement each other because rational choice would look at decision-making in an environment of ideal information processing. So as a baseline of what should be done, if it could be done, it's interesting, and it could help if people are willing to accept the idea that they're not looking at information equally, that it could help in the decision-making process for people to adjust as they go along. I think it would be very difficult, but I think that it establishes an ideal baseline, and that could, in theory, be useful to correct some of the information processing errors that we as human beings always follow. I should note, however, that the economic sciences are also moving away from rational choice. It had its flair in political science, but that's sort of now it's a little pocket. And I think that people are finding more rewards from understanding how human beings actually think and process information, right, rather than the ideal.
Right. So one of the questions from the audience is, can you elaborate on how these images are created, and are they stable?
Yes, they're created by the environment. People, there's no formula here. People need to understand the world that they live in, and they create images in accordance with that. And the images will shift as the environment shifts. I think also that, as I said earlier, this is really a very Western-centric kind of approach. Not in theory, but in practicality. I've had students who have done work in other parts of the world who find that there are other images functioning in other sectors of the world that are not included in the framework, and images can disappear. During the Cold War, there was no rogue image on the part of the West looking at other actors. Instead, what we tended to have was a dependent of the enemy. So countries like Cuba, North Korea, they would be seen differently than the rogue image today because they had an increase in capability as a consequence of their association with the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union disappeared, the image disappeared. It just disappeared. And it was replaced by a different image, the rogue image. There's no reason to think that something like the dependent of the enemy may exist in other parts of the world, in other subsystems where you have that kind of political dynamic still going on with different kinds of actors, not the Soviet Union or anything, but different kinds of actors. So yes, they're not stable. They evolve. They are cognitively efficient. So they're based on the world that people live in. I should say, let me add one more thing to that, which is that early on, we used to think that images were very difficult to change. But I think that recent research has shown that they can shift very quickly and very profoundly as well.
Right. So there is another question from the audience. Dr. Haddadi asked you, where does China now fits into the political images?
I think China is moving more and more into an enemy image. And it's the thing that keeps it from being clearly seen as an enemy is its capability factors. But I think, we often think of capability in military terms, but in China, it's going to be economic terms. And I think that especially in the United States, it's gone from being a country that did not fit to a country that is moving steadily, progressively towards the enemy image. And that does not bode well for future international politics. Mohammad, you're on mute.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So I have a question about the relationship between image theory and other IR or international relations theories. For instance, a structural realism or liberalism. So because image theory focuses at the individual level, so do they complement each other, or what do you think about the relationship between them?
I think they absolutely complement each other because those grander theories are theories that look at the structure of the environment. And what we see in image theory is what people would like to do if the environment permits it. The environment often doesn't. So if you have a combination of an understanding from a realist or structural realist perspective of the nature of the system that countries are functioning in, as small clusters or more broadly, then you can see when the environment is simply not going to permit people to follow the strategy that they would like to follow. And then, we have the interesting analytical question, okay, then what do they do? Do they do nothing? Do they try some alternative small tactics that will try to shift the environment so that they can actually pursue the policy they would like to pursue? And I think the other aspect to what the realist or neoliberal theories can do is to look at the distribution of threats and opportunities in the environment, which images and social identity factors really pick up on. Once they are identified by individuals or groups of people, then the threats or opportunities are identified by the policymaking circles, then the strategy is going to move forward.
Right.
So I don't see this as competitive. I see these theories as asking different questions about different aspects of the political the domestic and international political system that can be very useful together.
Right. So also I know that image theory is useful for analyzing domestic politics. So what do you think about, let's say, social movements in the US, BLM movement last year in 2020? So can you talk a little bit about analysis of social movements or domestic politics?
Yes, it's particularly useful in countries that have profound ethnic divisions, understanding domestic politics, their perceptions of one another, of the different groups, and again, the strategies that they're going to pursue in order to try to improve the position for their group. In a country like the United States, which is really complicated in terms of identity groups, there has been some research that's looked at the racial mutual imagery among racial groups, and some that can also address the social movements like Black Lives Matter, wherein the perception of the broader political system is that of the imperialist. Now, these are people who are either disenfranchised or sympathetic with those who are disenfranchised and are not treated well by the political system or the criminal justice system. And you see exactly this notion that people will move to try to change their circumstances when they see a realistic possibility of an alternative that's achievable. And that's what you see with these social movements. People have identified where the cracks in the system, they've identified the problems in the system that they believe is controlled by an imperialistic elite, and they're trying to break it with the demonstrations and organization. And they've managed to survive so far.
Okay, thank you so much. So there is a question that's not directly related to today's presentation. One of them is that, so Dr. Taheri asked you, can you talk a little bit about the position of the study on genes in political psychology in the US? Is there any chance that studying genes can tell us a lot about political behavior?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I'm not sure how useful it is, but it's incredibly interesting. There's at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, their political psychologists do neuroscience and genetic and evolutionary political psychology. And it really, I think it helps us understand some of the foundational aspects of political behavior that are just rooted in our genes, wired into us because of our genes. But there's work by a guy named John Hibbing at University of Nebraska Lincoln, and if your viewers are interested in his work, which is he looks at biological differences among liberals and conservatives in the United States. He gave a lecture at the Thomas Foley Institute at Washington State University in February, I think of 2020, maybe 2019. You can find the video, John Hibbings. You can find the video on the Foley website, the Foley Institute website. And I mean, the research that he does is fascinating. It shows that liberals and conservatives differ dramatically in terms of response to threat. Conservatives are much quicker to identify a threat and respond to it. They're much more fascinated by it. They tend to be more, I don't know if rigid is the word, but committed to stereotypes or images in their environment. So it is a growing area. It's fascinating, just fascinating. And it's across the board. It's evolutionary psychology, genetics, and neurobiology as well.
Right. And I think the University of Iran focuses on neuropsychology and the impact of neuroscience on political behavior. They have a political psychology program. So another question from the audience is that, do political leaders take advantage of psychopath or antisocial behavior in their political behaviors?
You can't help but think about Donald Trump with that one. I think some of them do. I think some of them are interested in having an attack dog. You know, they have their sidekick who goes out and sends messages that are so vicious that they can't do it themselves. Or they have people who will go out and present a picture of a conspiracy or an enemy that is so profound and so hardcore that it's very difficult to crack it with alternative information. Steve Bannon comes to mind, Rudy Giuliani, some of those others, even during the George H.W. Bush administration, it was John Sununu who was the attack dog. So they do have, I don't know if they're certifiably crazy, but they do have people who really violate all the normal bounds of political discourse in order to shore up a position that the administration is taking.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Thank you so much. So my last question is about your, if you have any other questions from the audience, please ask them in chat. Or you can simply raise your hand and ask your question. So, my question is about your introduction to political psychology. So we know that a new edition is coming in 2022. So what are new in this edition? Because the Iranian audience has read maybe the first or the second edition, the translation of the first and second edition. What are some of the new adds-on or changes in the book?
Well, it's there's a lot of difference between the first edition and the fourth edition. The third and fourth editions really catch us up on recent American elections, particularly the election of Barack Obama and then the election of Donald Trump. It also looks at some of the trends in terms of political identity in the United States and focuses in on white identity, which it can be associated with racism, or it may just be white identity with fears arising in the white parts of the white population in the United States about their position, their dominant position in American politics, and how that's affecting the way they view politics and will view politics for a long time to come. So the edition looks at changes in race, in racial relations, which really have traveled a long distance, both good and bad. In the elections chapter, we talk a lot about the election of Donald Trump. Then we also expand the social movements chapter to include, well, actually the social movements chapter was first introduced in the third edition, so it's now been updated in the fourth edition, and it includes from the past edition, the Arab Spring. It includes Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, the alt-right movement in the United States, the civil rights movement from the past, and then the ethnic conflict chapter is updated to include more on Syria, more updates on Iraq. We talk about the Rohingya in Myanmar and what's happened to them, and the terrorism chapter has also been updated by my co-author, Elena Masters. We finished going over the last edited chapters last week, so there's nothing left to do but to put it into print.
Right. So a lot of changes and updates. So thank you so much, Dr. Cottam, for your presentation. It was a pleasure having you for our Iranian audience. Due to restrictions from Zoom, we couldn't have a lot of people today, 15, but many people can watch the video of this presentation later. It's available on my YouTube channel, and also it will be on social accounts of the Iranian Political Science Association on Telegram and the Iranian House of Social Science Scholars. Thank you so much, our dear audience, and wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.